Hey everyone, and welcome back to Audiobooks Quiver. Today we're going in depth with a book that's really had an impact on how people think about their daily
That's
routines.
the power of habit, right?
Yeah, The Power of Habit by Charles Duhigg. He really gets into how those automatic behaviors we all have can actually lead to some really big changes, both in our personal lives and professionally.
It's pretty amazing when you start to see how much of what we do every day is just habit, not really conscious decisions.
Absolutely. In fact, there's some research from Duke University that says over 40%, that's almost half of our daily actions are totally driven by habit. It's like we're on autopilot for a huge chunk of our day.
Wow, that's kind of scary when you think about it. So, where do we start? I mean, how do we even begin to understand these habits?
Well, Duhigg starts off with this concept called the habit loop. He explains it as this three-part neurological pattern. There's a cue, which is basically the trigger for a behavior, the routine, which is the behavior itself, and then the reward.
The reward.
Yeah, it's that feeling of satisfaction you get that kind of makes the loop stick.
Oh, okay. It makes sense. You do something and your brain's like, hey, that felt good. Let's do it again.
Exactly. And Duhigg gives this really cool example. This U.S. major in Iraq, he was trying to figure out how to prevent these riots that kept happening in a plaza.
Oh, yeah. What do you do?
He realized that the crowds gathering were responding to a cue, in this case, food vendors being there. Then they'd hang out, socialize, and eat, which was their reward.
Ah, so he got rid of the food vendors.
Yep, broke the loop, and the crowd stopped gathering. Pretty clever, huh?
That's incredible. It shows how even in really complex social situations, these habit loops are at play. So how do we actually change these habits then?
Well, that's where Duhigg gets into what he called the golden rule of habit change.
Hmm.
It says to keep the cue and the reward the same, but change the routine.
Interesting. Do you have an example of that?
He talks about Alcoholics Anonymous. AA doesn't tell people to ignore that feeling of wanting relief or belonging, which is the cue, right?
Right.
And they don't deny the reward, which is feeling better. Instead, they give people a new routine to reach that reward.
Yeah.
Meetings, support groups, things like that.
So it's like redirecting the craving, not trying to eliminate it altogether. Makes a lot of sense. But I imagine it's still really tough to change those deeply ingrained routines. What does Duhigg say about that?
Well, he talks about the importance of belief. You really have to believe that the new routine is going to work for you, whether it's because of faith, a community, or just believing in yourself.
Belief, huh? Like you have to be all in.
It seems like it. He gives the example of this woman, Mandy. She was a chronic nail biter.
I used to bite my nails too when I was a kid.
Really?
Yeah, it drove my mom nuts.
Well, Mandy, she finally quit by replacing the biting with rubbing a bead. Same cue, which was anxiety, same reward. There's a sense of relief, but a completely different routine. And it worked because she believed in it.
Okay, so changing routines can work if you have the right mindset. But what about those habits that seem so ingrained, so much a part of who we are? Can those really be changed?
That's where Duhigg introduces this concept of keystone habits. These are habits that have a domino effect, creating a cascade of changes in other areas of your life.
Keystone habits, that's interesting. Kind of like if you shift one key habit, everything else starts to fall into place.
Exactly. And one of the most powerful examples he gives is Tony Dungy, the NFL coach. He instilled these keystone habits of discipline and focus in his teams. He really emphasized these seemingly small details, but it had a huge impact on their overall performance.
It's like those little wins building momentum. Reminds me of Michael Phelps and his insane focus on those routine wins. It all built up to Olympic success.
We got it. Small wins, big results.
Yeah.
So we've talked about how habits work, how to change them, but what happens when things get really shaken up? What about those times when we're forced to confront our habits in a crisis?
That's a great question. I'm curious to hear what Duhigg has to say about that.
He actually dedicates a whole chapter to it, the power of a crisis. He argues that while crises are obviously tough, they can also be these incredible opportunities for habit change.
Really? I wouldn't have thought that.
Yeah, it's counterintuitive, right?
Yeah.
But think about it. During a crisis, your usual routines get disrupted, so you're more open to trying new things. He uses the example of Paul O'Neill, former CEO of Alcoa.
Oh, I've heard of him. He's like a business legend.
Yeah, he completely transformed Alcoa's safety culture. And he did it by focusing on one single keystone habit: 0 workplace injuries. It might sound simple, but that one change had a huge impact on the company's overall performance.
Safety leading to better productivity and even financial success. That's amazing.
It is. And this idea of crisis as a catalyst for change, it applies to our personal lives too. The book mentions this Harvard study that found that those major life events, whether good or bad, can actually be triggers for shifting habits.
So even when things are tough, there's potential for growth. I like that. It's a hopeful way to look at challenging times.
Absolutely. But now, let's shift gears a bit and talk about something that might make you a little uneasy. Chapter 6 is all about how companies are using data to predict and even influence our shopping habits.
Oh, that sounds a little creepy, like Big Brother watching over our shopping carts.
Kinda, yeah. Duhigg uses this fascinating example of Target. They were analyzing customer data to figure out who was pregnant, so they could target them with ads for baby stuff.
And they were doing this before people even announced their pregnancies. That's wild.
Yep. And to avoid freaking people out, Target had to get creative. They started mixing those baby product ads with ads for totally random things, just to throw people off the scent.
It makes you wonder how much control we really have over our choices, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's definitely something to think about.
So we've been talking about personal habits, but what about those habits that operate on a larger scale, like in social situations or even whole societies?
Yeah, that's where things get really interesting. Duhigg gives this great example, the Montgomery bus boycott.
Oh, right. That was a pivotal moment in the civil rights movement.
It is, and we often just attribute it to Rosa Parks refusing to give up her seat.
Right, that's the iconic image.
But Duhigg kind of digs deeper and shows that there were these really deeply ingrained social networks and habits within the Black community that were already in place.
Ah, so it wasn't just this spontaneous act of defiance.
Exactly. The boycott was actually built on years of community organizing, shared experiences, and this strong sense of collective identity.
Wow, so those habits were already a part of their daily lives. It makes sense that they would use those same networks and habits to fight for their rights.
Exactly. Duhigg talks about the power of weak ties, which are basically those connections you have with acquaintances. You might not think they're that important, but they actually play a huge role in spreading information and influencing social norms.
So even those casual interactions can have a big impact.
Absolutely. And in the case of the boycott, those weaker ties helped to get the message out to a much wider audience and created this feeling that everyone needed to participate.
It's like social pressure, right? If everyone around you is doing something, you feel like you should too.
There's definitely an element of that. And Duhigg points out that in a tightly knit community like Montgomery's Black community, going against the grain could actually have real consequences.
Oh, like social isolation or losing that sense of belonging?
Exactly. It shows how powerful those social bonds can be. So the boycott was successful because it tapped into these existing habits of friendship and support that were already deeply ingrained in the community. But now for something completely different, let's talk about Saddleback Church.
Okay, how does a church fit into all of this?
Well, Duhigg talks about how religious institutions use these same principles of habit formation to grow their congregations.
Interesting. So they're not just relying on faith, they're actually using strategies to encourage participation.
Right. Saddleback Church did this really clever thing where they created small groups that met weekly in members' homes. Instead of going to a big service, people were meeting in these smaller, more intimate settings.
So it became more about personal connection.
Exactly. And by meeting regularly with the same group of people, attending church went from being this conscious decision to just a normal part of the routine.
I see. It became a habit.
Exactly. Duhigg explains that it tapped into this basic human need for connection and belonging. It also created a sense of responsibility where members felt accountable to each other, not just to the church as a whole.
That makes sense. You're more likely to show up if you know your friends are expecting you.
It's like those workout groups or book clubs. The social aspect helps you stay committed. So we've seen how habits can be used for positive change, but we've got to talk about the potential downsides as well. In Chapter 9, Brain on Autopilot, Duhigg gets into the potential dangers of these automatic behaviors, especially when we're not fully in control.
Oh, yeah, there's got to be a dark side to all of this, right?
There is.
Yep.
And the example that really drives this point home is the story of Brian Thomas. He killed his wife during a sleep terror.
That's terrifying. So he was literally asleep when it happened.
Yeah. And because of that, he was acquitted. The court recognized that he wasn't consciously aware of what he was doing.
Wow, that raises all sorts of questions about accountability, doesn't it?
It does. It makes you think about those moments when your brain is on autopilot and you're not really in control of your actions, like when you drive to work and you can't even remember the last few miles.
Oh, yeah, I do that all the time. Scary to think that we can be so disconnected from what we're doing. So how do we become more aware of these unconscious habits?
That's a great question. And it leads us to another really interesting example from Chapter 9. Patty, the compulsive gambler. Her story is really different from Brian Thomas's because she was actually held accountable for her gambling debts.
Even though she was addicted.
Yeah, even though she argued that her addiction was controlling her behavior.
That seems kind of unfair.
It's tricky, right? We know that addiction is a disease that can hijack the brain.
But we also hold people responsible for their actions.
It's a complex issue. Duhigg talks about how certain cues can trigger these automatic behaviors that are really hard to resist, especially for people with addictions.
So it's like their brain is on autopilot and they can't help themselves.
Exactly. And it makes you wonder how much free will we really have when we're bombarded with all these triggers that tap into our deepest desires, whether it's for gambling, food, drugs, or even just checking our phones.
So what's the solution? How do we fight back against these powerful forces?
Well, that's what Duhigg dives into in the final chapter. He gives us a practical framework for changing these unwanted habits and creating new ones that work for us.
I'm all ears. Tell me more about this framework.
Welcome back to Audiobooks Quiver.
We're going to wrap up our deep dive into The Power of Habit by Charles Duhigg.
Yeah, and in this final part, we're really getting to the heart of the matter. How do we actually change those habits that aren't working for us?
And Duhigg doesn't disappoint, right? He lays out this really clear framework for making those changes. He calls it the framework for habit change. And it's all about taking action, not just understanding the theory, but actually having a plan.
Exactly. So let's break it down. Step 1 is identify the routine.
Which might sound simple enough, but Duhigg really stresses that it's about going deeper than just noticing the habit. You really have to break it down into those tiny individual actions.
Right. It's like becoming a habit detective.
Exactly. You have to figure out each step in the process. Like if your habit is checking social media before bed, you'd need to map out the whole sequence. You know, brushing your teeth, getting into pajamas, grabbing your phone, opening the app, and then boom, you're scrolling.
Ah, I see. So by breaking it down like that, you can start to figure out where those weak points are, those moments where you might be able to interrupt the pattern.
Exactly. Awareness is key. Now, step 2 is all about those rewards.
Okay, the rewards. That's where things get interesting.
Duhigg points out that habits stick around because they give us something we want, even if it's not obvious right away.
Like with the social media thing, maybe it's the entertainment, or maybe it's a sense of connection, or maybe it's just a way to avoid thinking about something else.
It could be anything, really. So what Duhigg suggests is actually experimenting with different rewards. Like, instead of checking social media, try reading a book or meditating for a few minutes. If you don't feel that urge to scroll, then you know the real reward wasn't the social media itself, it was something else.
Wow, that's so smart. It's like you're figuring out what your brain is really craving.
Exactly. Once you know that, you can find healthier ways to satisfy that need. Now, step 3 is all about isolating the cue.
Okay, the cue, that's what triggers the habit in the first place, right?
It's that signal from your environment that kicks off the whole cycle. It could be a certain time of day or a place or an emotion or even just something you did right before.
So, like, if I always crave a snack when I walk into the kitchen,
Yeah.
even if I'm not actually hungry, that's my cue.
Exactly. Or maybe for our social media person, it's that feeling of tiredness at the end of the day or seeing their phone on the nightstand. Once you know what your cue is, you can start figuring out how to avoid it or change how you react to it.
So, like, maybe I keep my phone out of the bedroom, or I pick a different activity to do before bed, or I just notice that urge to scroll and make a conscious choice to do something else.
Right. You're basically taking control of the situation. Now, the final step is where it all comes together. Step 4 is have a plan.
Okay, the plan. This is where the rubber meets the road.
Duhigg says it's not enough to just understand your habits. You need a concrete plan for how you're going to break the old pattern and build a new one.
So if we stick with our social media example, maybe that means having a book ready to go instead of my phone. Or maybe I decide I'm going to meditate for a few minutes before bed. Or I could even set a timer for my social media use.
Those are all great ideas. The key is to have a specific, actionable plan for what you're going to do when that cue pops up. Duhigg even suggests writing it down and mentally rehearsing it so it becomes more automatic.
It's like you're training your brain to respond in a new way.
Exactly. And the more you practice, the easier it gets. What I really like about Duhigg's approach is that it's not about willpower or trying to force yourself to change overnight. It's about working with your brain, not against it.
I totally agree. He acknowledges that habits are powerful, but he also gives us these really practical tools for reshaping them.
And to make it even more convincing, he uses all these real-life examples of people who have successfully changed their habits using this framework.
It's one thing to hear the theory, but it's so much more powerful to see how it works in practice. And what's even more fascinating is that Duhigg doesn't just focus on individual habits, he also talks about how these same principles can be applied to organizations and even entire societies.
The examples of the Montgomery bus boycott and Saddleback Church really show how understanding social habits can be used to create positive change on a larger scale.
It's inspiring to see how those everyday routines, those habits, can actually shape the world around us.
The power of habit really opens up a whole new way of looking at the things we do automatically. And it gives us hope that we can actually change those things if we want to.
It's a message of empowerment, reminding us that we're not just stuck with the habits we have. We have the power to create new ones that lead to a better life.
And on that note, we've come to the end of our deep dive into The Power of Habit by Charles Duhigg. We hope you've enjoyed exploring the science of habit formation with us.
And we hope you feel inspired to put these principles into practice in your own lives. Don't forget to like and follow Audiobooks Quiver's YouTube channel for more insightful book summaries and reviews.
We're here to help you unlock the power of great books and make those words come to life.
Thanks for listening.